Shock and disappointment. Those were the emotions felt by the family and friends of Matthew Hedges on his being sentenced to life in an Abu Dhabi jail. The 31-year-old was detained last May after completing some academic research. He'd hoped to be freed, but instead he was convicted of spying. His friends can't believe it.
Terrible for the family and also very scary for us who are colleagues of Matt and are doing our own research as well, because what this episode tells the world is that there is a new and different way of repressing academic research as well as journalists as well as analysts alike.
Hedges works at Durham University and insists he is innocent. He says he was researching security strategy. The university's backing him up. Even before the sentencing, his wife Daniela was at her wit's end.
I have done absolutely everything in my power in order to get Matt back home safely. And he is a British citizen, and the British government owe him that duty. I don't know what they should do or how they should do it, but I do feel that they should have much more arduous efforts towards bringing him back home safely to me.
The UK government has denied Hedges ever spied for them, despite reports that he signed a confession written in Arabic, but which he doesn't understand.
We see absolutely no evidence for any of the charges laid against him. We're very concerned for his welfare. The UAE is supposed to be a friend and ally of Britain's. We've given them repeated assurances about Matthew. And, if we can't resolve this, there are going to be serious diplomatic consequences.
Britain does have strong links with the UAE, both in business and in education, and about 120,000 UK nationals live there. Experts in the UAE judiciary have said the life sentence of 25 years is not final. Hedges can appeal. Evelyn Laverick, Euronews.
Well, let's get some more on that story with Alistair Sanford in the studio. Good morning, Alistair.
Good morning, Belle.
Just weeks ago, it looked like the British Foreign Office had managed to secure a release of Matthew Hedges. Now we're seeing this. I mean, it's a fairly shocking turnaround.
Yes, this has stunned lots of people. As you say, Matthew Hedges had been released on bail in late October. It looked like that was paving the way for a definitive release. And now, of course, he's facing a life sentence. The UAE's Attorney General has issued a statement saying that he pleaded guilty, saying that there was compelling legal evidence that was presented to him, and defending the way the case was carried out, saying that there were thorough judicial investigations and that he was accorded his full rights to a fair and transparent trial. Now, to many outsiders, that looks like utter nonsense. Durham University says the judgment was in the absence of anything resembling due process or a fair trial. As we've heard, yesterday's proceedings lasted 5 minutes. His lawyer wasn't present. His family says that during the first 6 weeks of his detention, he was interrogated without a lawyer and he had no consular access. And that's during the period during which he's said to have signed that confession in Arabic. Durham says there was no evidence that he was doing anything other than carrying out legitimate academic research. We heard there from the British Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and Theresa May says that the government is raising it at the highest level with the authorities, and they will continue to press the case.
What about the political implications of all of this? I mean, the UK and the UAE normally have strong ties.
Well, yes, political and economic implications. Yes, of course, the United Arab Emirates gives the image of being a glossy, modern country. The ties are very close between the UK in particular, but other European countries as well. Thousands of companies do business. British universities are present out there. But observers say that, well, there's something increasingly darker going on behind the scenes and that their stance is increasingly intolerant and repressive. It's said there are sensitivities in particular over the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Human Rights Watch says it's not just the UAE, but other countries like Saudi Arabia as well. They've noticed a clampdown that's even more fierce over the last year, with dissent not being tolerated. And they accuse the West of failing in their in failing to stand up to it, saying their diplomatic approach has failed. It seems that in the UAE in particular, we know that several people have been caught up in what seems to be a pretty arbitrary judicial system. There are many victims of injustice where pretty innocuous events, suddenly they end up getting thrown in jail, sometimes for months on end. There's an organisation called Detained in Dubai, which has documented these cases and says it helps people facing what they say are sometimes unbelievable situations they never imagined possible. Now, some Conservative MPs in the UK are now calling for a change of stance for a much more robust defence of fundamental human rights. The question, of course, is how that will be translated into policy.
We've heard Angela Merkel saying that any declaration has to be agreed before Sunday's summit can go ahead. Is that normal protocol for this sort of a meeting?
It isn't, Bell, normal procedure, but then, of course, this is not a normal EU summit. This has been specially convened to try and sign off on this Brexit deal. And really what Angela Merkel is doing this morning is firing a warning shot, more specifically at rather Spain than Britain, because she's insistent that everything needs to be signed, sealed and delivered if she is going to turn up here on Sunday morning. But be in no doubt, she is on one side of the debate, other countries on the other side, not least of all France. There's a bit of a German-Franco split on this, with Emmanuel Macron potentially wanting some negotiations to take place on Sunday alongside other countries such as the Netherlands and indeed Denmark. I suspect that looks unlikely, not least of all because, of course, the withdrawal agreement, the main bulk of this deal, the 585-page document, is now essentially done. It is a legal text. All this wrangling, the visit by Theresa May, the further visit that we're expecting on Saturday, is in regards to this future political declaration. Now, when it was published last week, it was 7 pages long. We expect it to be over 20 pages by the time we see it at the weekend. And why is it so important? Well, essentially, it is where Theresa May is hoping to gain some ground in these negotiations, ground that she desperately needs to sell back home to her British MPs, who clearly aren't on board with the withdrawal agreement, but she is hoping that she can get something in the future declaration that will win them over.
And Darren, this draft agreement seems to have been on a roller coaster ever since it was announced last week. Just how close are we, do you think, to seeing this deal signed off?
I think we are pretty close in the grand scheme of things, Belle. There's an awful lot of bluster, a little bit of last-minute drama, as we would expect with these things. It doesn't work badly for both sides in these negotiations. But I think Spain will, in the end, on Gibraltar, potentially give some ground. After all, there are elections in Andalusia. Many see this as a domestic ploy. The European Union wants this deal to succeed. I think we will get there. But the big question fundamentally has not changed, which is, yes, we could see this all signed on Sunday, but the key moment will come in the British Parliament. We now have over 80 Conservative MPs, Bell, saying they're going to vote against this. That's on top of all the opposition parties and potentially the DUP as well. The big question for Theresa May is, can she win enough? Did she win enough last night? Will she win enough on Saturday? Will this deal be enough to win those MPs rounds? Because if it isn't, and it is defeated in the House of Commons, where does that leave the Brexit negotiations then?
Emmanuel Macron has condemned fuel tax protests, which have seen 2 deaths, as well as hundreds of people injured. Those behind the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests, have vowed to block more roads as the government pushes on with economic reforms. Inspired by demonstrations in mainland France, protesters on the Indian Ocean island of Réunion have been blocking access to oil depots in further unrest. Brian Carter has the story.
A call to action across France in protest at the rising cost of diesel and petrol is even being answered on the overseas territory of Réunion. An eruption of violence not seen in 30 years on the island has resulted in scores injured or arrested. It sparked the need for a curfew and condemnation from President Emmanuel Macron.
On public order, I say it clearly. I have asked the government to be inflexible because the scenes in La Réunion and elsewhere are unacceptable.
In the rest of France, the protests have been on the wane since Saturday's mass demonstrations. But in Nantes on Wednesday, the roadblocks were back. The yellow vests, so called after the high visibility jackets motorists are required to carry in their cars, once again blocked motorways and roundabouts.
We will keep going 24 hours a day until Mr. Macron tells us, yes, we hear you, because he's forgetting us and he doesn't realise his popularity is dropping. We are now defending the people, we are defending everyone.
The Gilets jaunes protest has even reached France's National Assembly. Member of Parliament Jean Lassalle wore his yellow high-vis jacket in a sign of solidarity but disrupted proceedings. The Yellow Vest movement may have begun as a backlash against government taxes adding to fuel hikes, but it quickly tapped the frustration at a president perceived as squeezing the less well-off while cutting taxes for the rich. A new call for mobilization has been launched to block the French capital this Saturday.
Well, let's get an update from Brian Carter, who is in Paris for us this morning. Good morning, Brian. What impact, if any, are these protests likely to have on Macron's planned economic reforms?
Good morning, Belle. Well, at the moment, the government doesn't seem to be backing down on its reforms, especially now that, as I said in the video you just saw, the movement seems to be phasing down. Yesterday, we only counted 7,000 protesters across France at different locations in France, and that number has been gradually diminishing over the last few days. The government says that despite these protests, they will continue with the reform, especially the reform on fuel that will see another price hike in January. They say that this reform is necessary to fight against climate change and for ecological transition. But clearly the government seems to be on the defensive, probably for the first time since Macron came to power. They said initially that they want to discuss. Now they seem to be more open to dialogue. And even though the number of protesters has been gradually diminishing, the anger is clearly still there. You know, initially this movement was against the price of fuel, but it's morphed into much more against the loss of public services, against the cost of living, and it really showed a divide between urban France and rural France, especially rural France, where the car is needed to get to different places, and where public services have been gradually diminishing over the last few days. So clearly the anger is still there, it's still being expressed. A majority of the French people support the Yellow Vest movement, and some in France are already comparing it to the Five-Star Movement in Italy.
And Brian, you talked there about the anger still being there. How long are we expecting these protests to continue?
Well, Belle, here on Saturday, there will be a big protest. Thousands of people are expected. There have been two different calls on social media. More than 30,000 people said they were going to be there, and more than 200,000 said they were interested. They called for a complete shutdown of the capital. They call on people to come from all over France. So clearly, the success of this demonstration on Saturday will be a measure about this movement, whether this movement is here to stay or whether it was just a brief moment in French political life.